Have you ever been browsing the internet and all of a sudden a pop-up appears and then a file is downloaded onto your computer automatically without any user interaction? Have you ever wondered, how do they do that? What is happening? Or maybe you're a penetration tester, a red teamer, or an ethical hacker, and you're wondering, hey, that might be a pretty cool technique for some social engineering, some phishing, some deception, something that you want to weaponize and add to your toolkit. So in this video, that is exactly what we are going to do. I'm going to show you some syntax, some simple, quick showcase of how you might be able to put this together and instantly download a file onto a target or victim computer just by browsing to a page within their web browser like Google Chrome, Internet Explorer, or Firefox. So let's get to it. Okay, so I'm going to be working in my Windows 11 virtual machine. I do want to be targeting a Windows operating system for this. Gives it a little bit more realism, although we could totally write this within Linux, in Kali, in Ubuntu, whatever distribution you might like. I am going to open up my file explorer, and within my desktop, I do want to just simply create a new file. I'm going to create a text document, and we can end up renaming this, but ultimately we're going to create an HTML file. I'll call it index, and I'll actually change the view options to actually show file name extensions, and relieve my faces in the ways, but all that is hitting the show file name extensions options, so that when I rename this, I can right click and rename or edit the properties. I guess F2 is also a good hotkey that will work for me, and if I just change this to an HTML extension, that means I'm now working with a hypertext markup language file, and I can include any other markup language that would be worthwhile for a web browser to actually render. That it means we can also include JavaScript or some client-side code, and we get this pop-up, hey, if you change the file name extension, it might become unusable. Yep, we totally know what we're doing here, and now you can see that's been created on the desktop, and we can work with it in our file browser. What I'm going to do next is right-click and open with. I do want to open this with a text editor. I'll be using Visual Studio Code because I'm on Windows here. You could very well be using, Sublime Text, or if you're working in the Linux world, hey, you could be using Vim or Emacs or whatever text editor suits your fancy here. But now we are opened up this empty file, index.html, and we can start to write some HTML. We'll start off with a doc type, which is good, necessary boilerplate for HTML code, and all HTML tags need to begin and end with their element tags, right? These less than, greater than, arrows here, waka waka as you might hear them, and then we need a head tag and a body tag. This, if you aren't familiar with HTML, is where everything really lives within your application. What I'm going to end up doing is simply creating a header to have some text to render onto the page, but ultimately we need to be working within any tags that we particularly want, but ultimately we need to have JavaScript. Before I end up putting that together, I do just want to validate this looks good and works for us. So I'm going to hop back over to that, open up this file within my web browser, and there I do have this small, simple page. Good enough. Let's go ahead and start to write some JavaScript. I am going to end up putting this within our body tag because I do kind of want it to render right away. And I'm going to end up adding a script tag. Now this is how we could just natively end up writing JavaScript. I believe you could add some other attributes here to make it more, third party or external, or have it reference or source some other location. But for the sake of our learning demonstration and exploration, let's just put it all right here. So ultimately, we want to create a couple variables, because the way that we end up providing a file to download is by, kind of embedding the file into this own page so that it can just spit it out to the user. So we might give it a file name that we want to end up using. We could do something cheesy like Windows Updater.exe. Fair to say? Yeah? But then we need the actual file contents, or sort of the, file data, right? And how will we actually embed this into the page? Well, some way to do that is honestly just slapping the entire contents of the file that we want into this location, or into some JavaScript file, or something that it might be able to either externally load or read, just to still spit it out to you. And this is where you can really get creative. Again, for our showcase example, I'm just going to end up embedding this, but again, you could make it load or reach some other resource and actually access it some other way. You could have it redirect through a couple different layers of obfuscations or masks or whatever you want, but I'm just going to end up base64 encoding the data here. Now what I'll end up doing is actually probably grabbing the calculator application and then base64 encoding that. Let's see if I can do that nice and easy within PowerShell. Okay, I've opened up the PowerShell command line, and I know that I want to get all the contents of C Windows System32, and we'll just use, again, the calculator.exe as our proof of concept, as a small, trivial, innocent proof of concept. This gives us a whole lot of nothing. It is just the raw bytes, so we want to be able to actually embed that as base64. Let me grab the syntax, because I always forget how to do this in PowerShell. I'll find that online real quick. Okay, I just grabbed the syntax online. We create a base64 string variable where we convert to base64 string, getting the IO file, reading all bytes from the specific file here. This will end up spitting it into that base64 string variable, but for the sake of me being able to copy and paste it, I do just want to slap that to a temporary file. I guess I'll call that just temporary.log, and then we can go ahead and open that file. Code temporary.log. There we go. Here's a whole lot of base64. Cool. So we can copy and paste that. So now again, this is just a proof of concept as to how you might be able to do this. Again, this is kind of simple, pretty easy, kind of trivial. Again, you could add whatever redirection or creative stuff you might like here to make that a little bit more fun or stealthy. But ultimately, we're just using the base64 encoded rendition of the file, and now we need to be able to actually decode that within JavaScript. So what we can do is define a function here. While we have the file contents and the data here in base64, we need to convert that base64 to bytes, given some, I guess, base64 data as an argument, correct? Now we can go ahead and retrieve the binary values within JavaScript by running that ATOB function. And if you aren't familiar, ATOB will go ahead and base64 decode some values within JavaScript, and that's where we can pass in our base64 data. Now that returns a big long list, and we want to determine how long that list really is. So let's go ahead and create a new variable just to determine the length of the binary values. And then what we can do is ultimately create our own bytes data new array that we might like. We're going to end up creating a uint8 array so that we are just retrieving the integer representation of all of these bytes up to the length of the binary that we had already retrieved. Now, I know that is kind of weird to think about, but we're just basically creating a secondary placeholder for the bytes of the file, decoded from base64 and getting it into a representation that we can sanely play with within JavaScript. So the way that we have to do that is actually look through every single byte. So you'll use a for loop to do this. We'll loop I as our iterator and increment up to that binary length, adding and incrementing all the way across. I might need to add a var I here, okay? And what we could do then is actually say our bytes data at that index, or counting with that iterator I, can equal our binary values that we've already retrieved from base64 decoding this value, in actually getting the character code at the position I, or that index. So this will go ahead and return out, in fact, we actually have to return the bytes data buffer. So ultimately, our function will go ahead and base64 decode this and return it all as bytes that we can work with within JavaScript. And that is how we might be able to retrieve the data and slap it out to the browser in a file download. But we need to end up doing that by specifying, okay, our new file bytes can equal our base64 2 bytes function, passing in our file data that we know just above is that base64 encoded string. Perfect. Now, this is where the magic happens. This is where we have to go ahead and define a blob that will go ahead and actually encapsulate this data for us. In fact, that has to be a new blob because it's a sort of object here, and then we'll actually pass in the data or the file bytes that we've just retrieved up top into a blob. ultimately specifying, okay, this has a specific unique MIME type, so you pass that in with curly braces here to denote, okay, these are the options that might go to it. However, inside of the blob is the data that you need, and you can see Visual Studio Code is helping us define that, but ultimately our type is going to be an octet/stream, because this will be something that we have to download. So now that we've defined this blob object to kind of reference and refer to our data, we need to basically force the user to download this. And we can do that by basically creating a HTML anchor tag, or that A element that you often see. So we can say, hey, let's use our document to go ahead and create a new element, and we'll go ahead and create a simple A tag. We'll go ahead and append that to the body of our document. And we can even make it invisible by setting some CSS styling, changing the display to be none, so that way it will not render on the page. And now the important part, we need to create a URL that will reach out and actually access our blob that we created earlier. And I believe that is create object URL within that window sort of subcomponent or module within the window itself here. And we can go ahead and pass in our blob. Now we'll set this as our anchor's target here. A anchor href equals that URL that we've created. And then we want to actually force that to download our specific file name. That way it knows, okay, we're going to end up sending this file, Windows Updater, based off of the blob that we've determined created off of our base64 decoded data. And now that we have finally created that anchor object, we do need to force and click on that A tag and HTML element so it will begin the download automatically. We could also go ahead and use our window URL revoke object URL, and that will actually, I believe, remove this. And if there's any portion of this code that you don't exactly understand, the whole point is to learn here. Let me see what this ends up doing. It releases an existing object URL that was previously created by calling URL create object URL. So it looks pretty necessary for what we end up using with that syntax here. And this is actually ended up creating our blob object. And if you want to learn more about the blob, you can see it's basically a file-like object of that raw data that we've been able to carve out from our base64. And again, how you include this base64, it doesn't need to be just slapped into this whole document on its own. You could go ahead and actually retrieve that from a different location or get creative with it. But again, for the showcase here, that's A-okay. So let's go see this thing in action. I'm going to go ahead and open up my index.html, and theoretically, we should be able to see this thing start a download. Now, because this is an executable file, because it literally has a .exe, you should see some browsers say, hey, this is a little bit weird. Are you sure you want to download this? You don't normally download executables right off the internet. But this is still something that we might be able to work around and play with. And in fact, we'll get to tinker with some of these file names super quick. Ooh, actually, looks like Windows Updater just took that right away. You might have noticed that download down here. And of course, it is simply the calculator application. Oh, hey, Smart Screen probably at least saw that was a file with a mark of the web, or MOTW. That is something that if we go explore it, here I'll close this out. If I move to my downloads, here's our Windows Updater.exe that we just downloaded. It is, of course, the Windows calculator. But checking out the properties, over here, you might notice it has this optional security portion. It says, hey, this file came from another computer and might be blocked to help protect this computer. That is why Smart Screen and this blue thing ends up just popping up. If you wanted to run anyway or don't run, sure, you very well could. But actually just unblocking that in the properties is what ends up disabling and not needing Smart Screen. There we go. There's our innocent, benign proof of concept calculator here. But you can make this a payload, you can make this malicious, you could do really whatever you want with it. I'm a little bit surprised that that didn't, hey, trigger and warn, like, hey, are you sure you want to download that? It might be because it's already, assigned weighted native Windows executable. But how does that look in Edge? Let me actually open that up. We'll get back to my desktop. Let me open with Microsoft Edge. Oh, here it is. Windows Updater.exe isn't commonly downloaded. Or you make sure you trust this thing before you do. And then you can end up running that keep option. And then they're like, look, are you really sure you want to do this? Like, yeah. And it lets you do it. Then it's automatically downloaded. There was no interaction for me to do that other than, yes, I'm cool with it. But if we were to change this to something like a windowsupdater.com, and then if you wanted to, or like a batch script file, you very well could, but then you, of course, need to, have an appropriately typed file for that file extension. So that once the user clicks on it, it'll know to do that. I think also they do some interesting things here. If I make this an SCR, which is, again, a screensaver file that everyone was tweaking out in the previous videos that I might have misspoke on there, it is still a Windows executable, without a doubt. So I wonder if that will have the exact same functionality. Let's open this up in Chrome, windowsupdater.scr, double-clicking on that. We got Smart Screen. Oh, I do want to run that regardless, so let me hit Run anyway. There's our calculator. Let me try that with Edge. Open with Edge. Yep, not commonly downloaded. So let's try a different... Okay, leave me alone. Let me leave. You could use like Batch. The thing is, I have seen some browsers... Oh, Windows.bat just took it on its font. It didn't. I would have expected Chrome to try and add another suffix to this, like a .download or another file extension on top of the extension that it had previously. So, how does Edge look? Yep, not commonly downloaded. So Edge is being a little bit finickier than Chrome is. Let me clear out these downloads here. You could change this to .hta for a hypertext application, something that MSHTA might be able to put together. You could have it run a JavaScript file, not simply JavaScript, but targeting the Windows operating system, or VBA for Visual Basic, or VBS, or VBE. I think, yeah, one of those. I don't know. Or you can force download a malicious document, like a Microsoft Office macros document thing. A whole lot of options here. Let's try HTA. Let's see if that would come through. And of course, you would need to change the contents appropriately within your file data. But that's the proof of concept here, and this is that syntax that might let you do it. Try that. Windows Updater.hta. Cool. And if we wanted to, hey, it should let us just come through that without an issue. Now, again, this is an HTML file. If I were to host this on something like, hey, Apache or Nginx or Python, like a simple HTTP server or just an HTTP server, it should, I don't know, maybe do the very same thing. I'm opening this locally because it is client-side HTML and JavaScript. I wonder if that's worth anything changing. Do I have Python on this box? No. Python 3? No. All right, so I can't readily show you. I mean, I guess we could just slap that syntax somewhere else. Let me showcase this on a host. So I am just on my actual computer here. Let me create just a simple, hey, index.html. And let's open that with Sublime Text, slap it all this code in, and now let's get a terminal rolling. Cool, so here on my desktop, let's do a Python 3 TACM http.server. And yep, Python's good to do it. Okay, now I have a browser open. Let's go to localhost 8000 and, ooh, okay. Now Chrome is the one saying, hey, this type of file can harm your computer. Yes, and we can keep it. That's all the ask that it needs. Hey, super quick, sorry, John from the future here. Just wanted to make a note. This is actually something that some folks have seen Dropbox do. Even in the URL, like in the link that you open in your address bar, after the question mark where a couple of the like HTTP get variables are, I think there's one called DL, and I might be getting that name wrong. But honestly, just changing a 0 to a 1 or toggling that will make it an instant file download. So just an interesting tidbit, just want to note it. I think some people have noticed that's a little bit interesting or sketch sometimes. But hey, wanted to flag, Dropbox can do that just as well. So something to keep in mind, your mileage may vary with this. You do rely on a little bit of social engineering, a little bit of trickery, a little bit of, hey, getting the user to actually fall for opening this and detonating it on their own volition. You have at least made this easier by forcing and jamming the file download onto their machine, and it's a little bit more prompted. Like, oh, hey, it's a Windows update. You can very easily make that part of a ploy or deception, social engineering, phishing scheme to, trick a user to do something. I've heard this technique called a drive-by download. That is kind of what I tend to refer to it as. However, that has its own connotation, so I tried not to say that within the first minute of the video. With that said, hey, it is the syntax you might be able to use for HTML, JavaScript, force an instant file download, and that is all it really takes. I'll try and slap this code out on a GitHub gist or something so it's accessible for you, but that's all that we ended up doing. And you can go Google around if you'd like any more of that research and documentation on, like, oh, what is the blob? What is this window create URL, etc. You're just creating an element, forcing it to click, and having the code embedded in a way that the browser and JavaScript can render it out for you. Get creative with how you hide or mask that. It doesn't have to be base 64, but that is one way to do it. And for our learning showcase education here, thought that would be worthwhile. Thanks so much for watching, everybody. I've been rambling for way too long. Let's close this thing out here. I love you. I'll see you in the next video. Like, comment, subscribe. You know the drill. Thanks, everyone.